Okay, so welcome everyone to another deep dive.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Today we are going to be looking at some really interesting commentary, really thought-provoking stuff on the whole situation in Ukraine,
Yeah,
the ripples it's sending across the world.
absolutely.
And we've even got a bit of a public spat between Niall Ferguson,
Oh, yeah.
the historian,
Yeah.
and Vice President Vance.
Yeah, big names.
So I think this is going to be a fascinating deep dive into some really timely material.
I think so.
Our aim here is to try to pick out
Yeah.
the most important points and see how they fit into the bigger picture of global, power dynamics, geopolitics.
The global chessboard.
Exactly.
Yeah. Always shifting.
So the core of this is a recent interview
Yes.
with Niall Ferguson
Yeah,
on the Hoover Institution's Uncommon Knowledge YouTube channel.
that's a good one.
And he really gets into it.
Yeah, he did.
He's talking about Ukraine, the U.S.-China relationship, and then, of course, this very direct exchange he had with Vance.
It got a little heated, I heard.
Oh, yeah. So, as always, Ferguson,
Yeah.
he's coming at this from a very historical perspective.
That's his bread and butter.
Strategic thinking, he's...
Big picture guy.
Yeah. So let's just jump right in.
Let's do it.
He starts off by talking about this kind of stalemate
Right.
that's happening right now in Ukraine.
Yeah, we're kind of stuck in this weird in-between,
Yeah, 1/5 of the country,
give or take.
Crimea, Donbass, under Russian control.
Yeah.
But Russia can't seem to take any more land,
Uh-huh.
and Ukraine can't seem to push them out,
It's a really tough spot.
even with all the support they're getting.
Yeah, exactly.
And, of course, the human cost on both sides.
Of course.
It's horrific.
It's a tragedy.
And even the numbers themselves are
Oh, yeah.
heavily disputed.
Always a fog of war.
But one thing that came out that was really interesting was that back in February,
Oh, yeah.
around the 12th,
Wow.
the Trump administration started having these talks with Russia about ending the war.
Okay.
And it seems like initially
Yeah.
Ukraine wasn't even really involved.
Wow. So behind closed doors.
Yeah. And this really sheds light on
Makes you think.
Trump's Truth Social post a week later
Uh-huh.
on the 19th, where he's telling Zelensky
Right.
to move fast or risk losing his country.
Yeah. High stakes stuff.
And Ferguson reminds us that, the Ukrainian constitution
Yeah.
does allow for elections to be postponed during a crisis.
Right. So there's a legal basis for that kind of move.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So then we get to this this clash between Ferguson and Vance.
Oh, yeah. This is the juicy part.
So Ferguson is talking about
Yeah.
George H.W. Bush's statement in 1990.
This will not stand.
Yeah, regarding Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait.
Right.
And then he asks this really interesting question.
Uh-huh.
How are historians going to view the response to Russia invading Ukraine
Uh-huh.
from a Republican president this time?
Yeah. A very different situation.
And Vance did not take kindly to this.
No, he did not.
He went on Twitter and called Ferguson's view
Let me guess.
moralistic garbage
Oh, yeah. He went there.
and historical nonsense.
Wow.
So-
So
Shots fired.
yeah.
What happened next?
So what's fascinating is that Ferguson
Okay.
describes what happened next as a really good debate.
Huh.
And he says it's really important that the vice president is
Yeah.
engaging in this kind of public debate
Right. It's not every day you see that
about something so fundamental.
to U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah. And this exchange apparently
Wow.
went on for thousands of words.
That's a lot of words.
And it ended with what Ferguson describes as kind of an understanding.
Okay.
Like two men who had a fight outside a pub,
Uh-huh.
shaking hands and going in for a drink.
So they patch things up.
And he says a key takeaway for him was Vance's assurance that they weren't going to make concessions to Russia.
Interesting.
So despite that initial,
Yeah. A little bit of friction there.
friction, Ferguson actually had a lot of positive things to say.
About the Trump-Vance administration's approach to Ukraine.
Really?
Yeah, he says they're much closer to ending the war
Than anyone before.
than their predecessors ever got.
Huh. Okay.
He contrasts this with the Biden-Harris administration's,
Yeah.
kind of open-ended commitment to Ukrainian victory,
Right.
which Ferguson thinks became unrealistic after late 2022.
Okay. So a different strategic goal.
Yeah, so it seems like there's a shift
Uh-huh.
away from this idea of outright victory for Ukraine
Yeah.
and towards a negotiated settlement.
Interesting.
Now, Ferguson also gives the Trump-Vance administration credit for something else,
Okay. What's that?
shocking the Europeans
Oh, really?
into realizing they need to step up on security.
Okay. So like a wake-up call.
Yeah, he says all that blunt rhetoric Even the stuff that seemed critical of the Allies
Yeah.
was meant to highlight that the U.S. might not always be there.
To protect them.
Yeah.
Interesting tactic.
So this tough stance may have been a deliberate way to push Europe to take more ownership of their own defense.
Okay, that makes sense.
No, Ferguson is very clear, though.
Yeah.
And this is something Vance has said as well.
Okay.
That we are not in 1990.
No, we are not.
That post-Cold War moment where the U.S. was the only superpower.
Yeah.
It's over.
Long gone.
We're in what Ferguson calls Cold War II.
Catchy title.
And it's a completely different world.
Totally.
And one of the biggest differences, of course, is China.
Yeah.
And China's role in supporting Russia. He points out that China is still buying Russian oil.
Yeah.
But even more importantly, they're exporting dual-use technology.
Right.
That's really helping to prop up the Russian economy and the military.
So it's not just a one-on-one fight.
No, it's much more complicated than that.
We've got this whole other player on the board.
Exactly.
Okay, so how should we be thinking about this conflict then?
So Ferguson tries to give us a framework.
Okay.
And he uses these two historical examples
Right.
of American support,
Yeah.
South Korea and South Vietnam.
Right, so two very different outcomes.
He says, with Korea, there was this long stalemate,
Yeah.
difficult negotiations,
Mm-hmm.
but eventually they reached a lasting armistice.
Right.
And South Korea became this amazing success story.
Yeah, thriving democracy.
Prosperous democracy with a continued U.S. military presence.
Right, security guaranteed.
Exactly.
Oh.
Now, South Vietnam is a much darker picture.
Yeah, that didn't end so well.
Big U.S. involvement, then a negotiated withdrawal,
Yeah,
but ultimately Saigon falls.
and the country collapses.
The country collapses.
Not a good model to follow.
And Ferguson actually talked about these examples with Zelensky directly.
Wow.
He told him Ukraine should be aiming for the South Korean outcome.
Okay, so the positive one.
And this is why they're so focused on getting those strong security guarantees.
Yeah, they want that long-term stability.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
So now let's talk about some of the immediate possibilities for de-escalation.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Ferguson mentions this proposed 30-day ceasefire.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
The Trump administration supported it.
Uh-huh.
Apparently, Ukraine initially accepted it, but then Putin rejected it.
Of course he did.
And actually, he even increased military activity in the Kurs region.
Oh, wow, so escalating while they're talking peace.
It shows just how difficult it's going to be
Yeah.
to get any kind of truce.
Huge obstacles.
Huge obstacles.
Okay, so then we get to this debate about pressure.
Yeah,
Like, what kind of pressure is being put on Russia?
exactly.
What?
Ferguson talks about the Biden administration's sanctions,
Yeah.
which he calls kabuki
What does
sanctions.
that mean?
He thinks they look tough,
Yeah.
but haven't really hurt the Russian economy.
All show no substance.
Yeah, and then he asks this question.
Okay.
Is the Trump administration going to apply real pressure?
And by that he means...
Meaning both economic and military measures.
Okay, so really turning up the heat.
Yeah, and he suggests that without that kind of intense pressure, Putin might just keep fighting while he's talking peace.
Like a delaying tactic.
Just like North Vietnam did before the Paris Peace Accords.
Yeah, just buying time, regrouping.
So what about the European response?
Yeah, good question.
Because this is affecting them too.
Big time.
Ferguson says there's been a real shift in Europe
Oh,
away from this kind of complacency
right.
and towards this realization that the U.S. might not always be there to bail them out.
Yeah, the security blanket might be going away.
And he thinks the Trump administration's very direct approach, like Trump's criticism of Zelensky,
Yeah,
Vance's tough talk at the Munich Security Conference,
right.
all of that was meant to shock Europe into action.
A deliberate strategy.
Yeah, to get them to rethink their own defense.
Okay, interesting.
And it seems to have worked.
How so?
Ferguson talks about all these emergency discussions happening in the EU about giving security guarantees to Ukraine.
Okay.
There are even proposals for a joint European peacekeeping force.
Wow, big step.
And Macron even offered to extend France's nuclear deterrent.
Oh.
But Ferguson also brings up Victor Davis Hansen,
Yeah?
who's a bit more skeptical.
What does he say?
Hansen says that for a truly effective European deterrent, they need to completely transform their societies and economies.
So a much deeper change.
Yeah, not just military spending.
Right, it has to be a whole societal shift.
Now, one concrete development in all of this
Yeah.
is the rearmament of Germany
Oh, wow.
under Friedrich Merz.
The potential new chancellor.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Ferguson says the coalition negotiations are moving fast, and there's a firm commitment to increase defense spending,
Okay.
and invest in infrastructure.
So they're serious about this.
Yeah.
And what does Ferguson think about that?
He sees it as a major strategic blunder by Putin.
Oh, really?
He says Putin has basically woken up a sleeping giant.
Yeah, Germany's a big player.
And this is a huge change in the European security landscape.
Absolutely.
And it's directly linked to this conflict in Ukraine.
Wow, so much to unpack there.
I know.
So let's go back in time for a minute.
Right.
Ferguson brings up this quote from Irving Kristol
Right.
back in 1983.
Uh-huh.
Kristol was arguing that NATO dependency
Yeah.
had made Europe weak.
Politically.
Yeah, they'd become too reliant on the U.S.
Right. Yeah.
and lost some of their own vitality.
And Ferguson acknowledges that, by the 1970s,
Wow.
Europe had caught up to the U.S. economically.
Yeah.
So maybe the U.S. should have reevaluated its role in NATO sooner.
Okay.
But then he counters that
Really?
by reminding us that the Soviet threat in 1983 was very real.
Right.
And the need for U.S. nuclear deterrence against Russia is still there today.
So it's a tough balancing act
Yeah.
between encouraging Europe to stand on its own 2 feet, but also maintaining a strong collective defense.
Against a real threat.
Yeah.
So then Ferguson talks about this idea of European strategic autonomy,
Okay.
which sounds great in theory, but he points out the huge challenges. It's not just about money. It's also about time.
Right.
It would take decades to build up the capabilities they need,
In areas like
especially in things like AI and satellite communications.
where they still depend heavily on the U.S.
Yeah, it's a long road to true independence.
Okay, so zooming out
And so
again,
let's look at the bigger picture.
what's the global context?
Ferguson's point is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's part of this bigger Cold War, too.
Right.
And China is the leading superpower now.
And Russia is the sidekick.
Yeah, and he suggests that the Trump administration might be playing this really clever game.
What do you mean?
He calls it reverse Nixon.
Okay, remind me what Nixon did.
Well, Nixon opened up to China to counter the Soviet Union.
Right.
So reverse Nixon would mean
Driving a wedge between Russia and China.
to focus on China as the main challenge.
Wow, that's a bold move.
Yeah.
So how would that work?
Well, Ferguson thinks there are 3 key objectives here.
Okay, shoot.
First, wake up the Europeans.
Which he thinks they've mostly achieved.
Check.
Second, end the conflict in Ukraine.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, that's still a work in progress.
Yeah, ongoing.
And third, address the challenge from China.
Okay, the big one.
The big one.
So what about these security guarantees for Ukraine?
Right, because that's key.
Yeah.
Ferguson goes back to Victor Davis Hanson's skepticism about this idea of a commercial sector tripwire,
Meaning?
that economic investments will somehow deter Putin.
Okay.
And Ferguson himself isn't convinced that Ukrainian mineral rights are this big deterrent.
Yeah.
He says the proposed minerals deal was symbolic, but he thinks Zelensky made a mistake by criticizing it publicly in the Oval Office.
Oh, yeah, that was awkward.
Yeah, and he keeps saying how hard it's going to be to get a lasting Korea-style armistice without those guarantees.
So that's the sticking point.
Now, of course, there's a whole other side to this.
Yeah.
The emotional, ethical side.
A lot of people have criticized the Trump administration
For being too transactional.
for being too focused on this cold, real politic.
Yeah.
Ferguson even mentions the Malian dialogue,
Right. From ancient Greece.
where it's basically might makes right.
The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must.
Yeah, a pretty grim outlook.
It is.
He also mentions Andrew Roberts,
Uh-huh.
who really condemned that Oval Office exchange
Yeah.
and the UN vote.
Uh-huh.
He accused the U.S. of switching sides.
Oh, strong words.
But Ferguson also brings up Henry Kissinger,
Right. The master of real politics.
who always said that American idealism needs to be balanced
With practicality.
with a pragmatic realpolitik.
Yeah.
So Ferguson defends this focus on realpolitik.
Yeah.
But he does have some reservations.
Yeah.
He says that Oval Office scene was tough to watch.
Uh-huh.
But he thinks Zelensky's public disagreement was a mistake.
Okay.
And he says this Nixonian realpolitik of reducing commitments in some areas
Right.
to prepare for the China challenge.
Yeah.
It makes sense strategically, but there's no guarantee it'll work.
And if it fails?
And the real danger is that if it fails, it'll be seen as this huge moral failure.
Right, because they abandon their allies.
And that'll be hard to come back from.
History will judge them harshly.
So they also talk about the link between economic and foreign policy,
Oh, interesting.
specifically the use of tariffs.
Yeah.
Ferguson warns that these proposed tariff increases could be really disruptive.
Like on the level of...
He says we haven't seen anything like this since 1937.
Oh, wow. So a major economic shakeup.
So they're using domestic economic policy
as a tool in foreign policy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got tariffs. We've got real politics.
We also have Ferguson's law.
What's that?
This is something he came up with.
Okay.
He says great powers are in danger of declining.
When they spend more on debt than defense.
Yeah.
And guess what?
The U.S. has crossed that threshold.
Wow, that's not a good sign.
And he's not optimistic about reforming entitlement programs or reducing the deficit.
Yeah.
So this fiscal reality makes it really hard for the U.S. to project power globally.
Yeah, if you're drowning in debt, you can't really afford to be the world's policeman.
Now, looking ahead, Ferguson talks about the potential of AI.
Yeah.
He thinks it could lead to a productivity miracle.
Okay.
But he says it's still 5 to 10 years away.
Yeah.
And it'll require huge investments.
So not a quick fix.
No.
And how does this tie into China?
Well, this is where it gets really worrying.
Okay.
Ferguson suggests that Xi Jinping might be looking at all this disruption in the West and thinking this is his chance to act.
While the West is weak.
Yeah, especially when it comes to Taiwan.
Oh, yeah, Taiwan's the big one.
Because he knows that the U.S. and Europe might get stronger in the future.
Right. With rearmament, maybe fiscal reforms, AI.
Yeah.
So he might feel like he's got a limited window to make his move.
And the balance of power has already shifted. China's manufacturing capacity is way bigger than the U.S. now.
Right.
And even the U.S. military advantage.
In the Indo-Pacific.
In the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
It's not what it used to be.
Really?
They've done all these war games.
Yeah.
And there's no clear winning scenario for the U.S.
Not concerning.
And those recent Chinese military exercises,
they
were a real show of force.
Yeah, a reminder of what they're capable of.
So Ferguson's point is that Taiwan is the most important flashpoint in the world right now.
More than Ukraine.
More than anything else.
Because
it's the center of semiconductor manufacturing and the AI industry.
Future of technology.
So if China takes control of Taiwan, that's a huge blow to the U.S.
And to the whole world, really.
Yeah, and it undermines this whole real politics strategy.
Right.
And it could mean the end of U.S. primacy in the Indo-Pacific.
Huge stakes.
Huge stakes.
Okay, so looking back at history again.
Yeah. Ferguson says the U.S. isn't what it used to be.
We can't just outproduce our enemies anymore.
He says, look at shipyard capacity, for example.
Yeah.
China's is way bigger.
So the industrial advantage is gone.
Yeah, and he thinks future wars will be different.
How so?
Technology like drones might give smaller countries a fighting chance.
Against bigger powers.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But he's not optimistic.
Now.
He compares the U.S. now to Britain in the 1930s.
Facing the Axis power.
Yeah, without the same kind of industrial might to fall back on.
So a much more vulnerable position.
Yeah, and he says the possibility of World War III
is very real.
Very real.
Okay, so sobering stuff.
Yeah.
But what's the takeaway then?
So Ferguson concludes by saying that even though the administration's tactics might seem harsh, they're coming from this realization that America is in a much weaker position than it used to be.
Yeah, the world is multipolar now.
It's not the sole superpower anymore.
And that changes everything.
So in this deep dive, we've covered a lot. The situation in Ukraine, the shifting relationship between the U.S. and Europe, the challenge from China,
the big one,
and this whole tension between real politics and American idealism.
Right.
So here's a final thought for you.
Okay, hit me.
Given all of this, all these global power dynamics, these timelines, how do we balance the need to address these immediate crises?
Like Ukraine.
Yeah. These long-term strategic challenges.
From China.
Yeah, how do we do both?
It's a tough question.
It is.
It's the question of our time.
So we really encourage you to go and explore these issues.
Yeah.
Look into the history we've talked about. The Korean War negotiations, the fall of Saigon.
Nixon going to China.
Britain in the 1930s.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
And keep up with what's happening in Ukraine, in Europe.
And with China.
It's more important than ever to understand all of this.
I agree.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure as always.